The new Ghost in the Shell anime has finally arrived, and while that in itself is a reason to rejoice, as with pretty much any piece of new media these days, it also had to attract the rotten minds of windmill fighting chuds, who as usual know jack shit about what they are talking about, yet proudly boast around their immense cluelessness, bad-mouthing this new adaptation of a classic manga by angrily declaring it as woke, without even remotely understanding what woke truly means. One of the most prominent amongst these cronies would be Ranting For Vengeance, aka Daddy's little Grifter, who thinks going from looking like the illegitimate son of Bubbles from Trailer Park Boys to the most stereotypical looking teenage edgelord is doing his pathetic shtick any favors, when in reality it just makes him come off as even more laughable. On top of that, he tries to make people believe he's some kinda enlightened centrist. Yet all he ever does is parroting a bunch of right-wing talking points, spreading irrational hatred against queer people, or people of color whenever these people either dare to enjoy media, or show up in it themselves. To start things off relatively lighthearted, I'd like to talk about a rather silly complaint Bubbles Jr. had, which would be him declaring doomsday on this adaptation because the Major is smirking in this very scene of the new anime, whereas the same smirk can't be seen in the manga, which according to him means that Science Saru doesn't understand Ghost in the Shell, which completely ignores the fact that Motoko can be seen smirking dozens of times throughout the manga, amongst many other far more absurd facial expressions. And he also insists upon bringing up the old movie, which has absolutely nothing to do with the creative intentions of this project. You can't fail to accomplish something when that thing was never intended to be accomplished to begin with. On top of that, he also complains about the choice of music in this anime, going on about how inaccurate it is to the old movie. A complaint that makes no sense, cause how can a show's soundtrack be inaccurate to a movie, when neither have anything to do with each other? And if that wasn't absurd enough, he even insists that the choice of music is inaccurate to the manga. Another complaint that makes absolutely no sense, because on top of being a cyberpunk story, The Ghost in the Shell is also a crime story. And anyone with an iota of knowledge should quickly come to realize that old-school Japanese crime stories usually have soundtracks that are heavy on jazz music, both in iconic live-action works and in anime. Thus, it's only natural for an anime adaptation of a late 80s, early 90s cyberpunk police and crime manga to feature that kind of music. And even if we would only focus on Ghost in the Shell, the standalone complex series features upbeat music and also jazz in its soundtrack. But I doubt Bubbles Jr. would ever dare shit-talking Yoko Kanno's work, despite the similarities in genres to the music that Taisei Iwasaki composed for the new music. His complaints are also rather ironic, given that during the time I've been writing my script, he actually did a follow-up video in which he acknowledged the similarities between a work like The Ghost in the Shell and the iconic 80s crime series like Miami Vice, a show that featured jazz music and a noteworthy amount of humor. And yet he still declares it a sign of misunderstanding the source material, that Motoko dares to smirk in this scene, and that fun jazz music plays. And while this all still feels like fun and games, Bubbles Jr. couldn't be helped to have another one of his paranoid outbursts against the queer community. Even though he insists upon not being a right-winger, he loves to parrot their talking about irrationally shit-talking queer people within all sorts of fandoms. Daddy's little Grifter declares that anyone who thinks Ghost in the Shell is about being gay or trans should go fuck themselves and isn't a real fan. Which just goes to show you the immense lack of media literacy chuds like him have. Sure, on paper, looking at things from a surface-level standpoint, there may be no clear-cut messaging in Ghost in the Shell about these topics, but for anyone with actual media literacy, it should become very clear why queer people would appreciate this work. First of all, it's clear as day that Major Kusanagi is bisexual. Her only longer-lasting relationship throughout the story might be with a man, but before that, she clearly goes on to dates and has sex with women. So this pretty much is the depiction of some kind of lesbian polycool or threesome friends with benefitis relationship. And how that is just a normal, everyday thing in this world, given how a prominent figurehead within a special police department can just be in such a relationship without being ridiculed for it. And before anyone insists upon bringing this up as some kind of gotcha, yes, Masamune Shiro has talked about how he only drew a certain infamous scene the way he did, because he didn't want to draw naked men. What those people aren't aware of, though, is that he very clearly changed his mind about drawing naked men, given how his hentai art books, such as the Greaseberry series, is full of sex scenes involving one or multiple men. Oftentimes, it's groups of black men, which is funny given how irrationally pissed off chuds like Bubbles Jr. get when they have to witness black men in any kind of media. As superficial and absurd as Shiro's reasoning behind it may be, it doesn't change the fact that Motoko Kusanagi is a bisexual woman, and it's perfectly fine for any queer fan of this franchise to celebrate her as such, no matter how much it pisses of feeble-minded snowflakes like Ranting For Vengeance. Given how I've just addressed the major sex life, I'd like to take a little detour into a topic that talks more about anime in general, considering how the depiction of the infamous boat scene once again sparked some people into spewing a bunch of nonsense again. And that is this absurd myth that anti-woke chuds love to spread around, that modern and Western audiences have managed to influence the anime industry into censoring nudity at any given chance, which obviously is complete nonsense. Yes, the nudity in titles such as the new Ghost in the Shell or even the new Ranma half adaptation is censored. But that has nothing to do with modern influences, but simply with age restrictions that TV stations have established going back all the way to the 90s. Let's take Ranma half, for instance. In Japan, it airs on Nippon TV. And coincidentally, in the year 2000, a different Rumiko Takahashi adaptation, Inuyasha, also used to air on that very same channel, which censored the nudity that could be seen in the Inuyasha manga. And yet, Inuyasha is a beloved anime from the early 2000s that never sparks any kind of shitstorm from fear-mongering chuds. For those who insist upon the year 2000 not being far enough into the past, I'd like to remind everyone of the 1992 Sailor Moon anime, which always censored nudity in a similar fashion as the new Ranma half anime. And if anyone insists upon the 90s not being far enough in the past, we even had censored nudity in 80s anime, such as Dragon Ball, which censored scenes in which Bulma could be seen, or they only showed her naked up front for a millisecond in some blink and you miss it moment. And yet, despite anime already being censored all the way back in the 80s, chuds wanna insist upon anime like The Ghost in the Shell or Ranma half are getting censored because of modern Western influences, when it's just a matter of TV channels and time slots. These days, we still have channels such as ATX, where even in the 2020s, anime such as Interspecies Reviewers or Nukitashi, the animation air uncensored, that in their depiction of nudity are far more extreme than the old Ranma half anime, or the infamous boat scene from Ghost in the Shell. And aside from TV anime, we also have ONIs, the modern-day internet equivalent of OVAs, which do not need to obey to Japanese TV age restrictions, which would be titles such as Devilman Crybaby, Cyberpunk Edgerunners, or even Ghost in the Shell SAC 2045, which all got made to air exclusively on Netflix. And despite these chuds having a vendetta against Netflix being so woke, those titles all feature uncensored nudity. But enough of this detour into how censorship of nudity actually works in anime. And back to Ghost in the Shell, and to be more precisely, Bubbles Jr.'s irrational issue with trans people. Now, they may be no trans characters in the Ghost in the Shell, but what these chuds don't understand, that the world this series takes place in pretty much would be in favor of them. At the end of the first manga, Motoko is forced to switch bodies, and the new body she acquires happens to be a male body. Now, this may not tell us anything about her gender identity. At the end of the day, she's just a woman who happens to have her cyber brain temporarily inserted into a man's body. But the fact that this is possible to begin with does tell us a lot about the general world that Ghost in the Shell takes place in. A world in which modified cyborg bodies exist. And a world in which people, no matter their sex assigned at birth, can have whichever body they want to have. Forget about hormone therapy and gender reassignment surgery. In the world of Ghost in the Shell, as long as you have a cyber brain and the financial means, you can just have your cyber brain put into whichever body you'd like. It should come to nobody's surprise how this detail, especially in combination with all this talk about identity and individuality, is very appealing to queer people. Just because a story isn't about being queer doesn't mean that it can't entail details that still speak to these people, and it's perfectly fine for them to do so. You'd really have to be an absolutely moron to see anything wrong with that, since everyone is entitled to allowing media whichever way they want to. And since we are on the topic of trans identities, ironically in his weird follow-up video, Bubbles Jr., who again insists upon not being a right-winger, once again made a typical right-wing remark. Shit-talking trans people who dare to relate to a story arc within Osamu Tezuka's Blackjack. Because he wants to live in this fantasy land where queer people can't be a thing in classic Japanese media, as that would break his fragile ego that he wants to bolster up by fanboying over the hyper-masculine badassery of classic titles, such as Fist of the North Star. Yet he doesn't feel the need to bring up Osamu Tezuka's Princess Knight, which is about Princess Sapphire, who is born with both a boy's and a girl's heart. Though he surely would have some idiotic remark up his sleeve as to why non-binary people shouldn't dare relate with any of that. And chances are, despite his play-pretend expertise for old-school Japanese media, he'd probably never have the backbone to acknowledge Ryoko Ikeda's works, such as Rose of Versailles, or Claudine, or Hisashi Eguchi's Stop Hibari-kun. If a modern Western work of fiction would have a protagonist such as Hibari-kun, Chuds like Ranting For Vengeance would be the first to throw a hissy fit over it. Chances are you'd have trouble finding equally prominent Western characters in works by Western animation juggernauts, who would have never allowed for a character like Hibari-kun. Yet in Japan, this manga nearly outshined Akira Toriyama's Dr. Slump, and ultimately only failed to do so, because Hisashi Eguchi couldn't handle the heavy workload of being a full-time mangaka. While close-minded snowflakes like him will never have the backbone to admit it. There have always been plenty of clear-cut examples of queer characters throughout Japanese pop culture, decades before he was even born, and decades before anyone created this myth of modern Western influences and agendas, and no matter how much of their embarrassingly irrational hatred they want to spread.